This is episode 64 of the Life in Norway show. Today we're talking about a gap in Norway's immigration rules, which entrepreneurs can easily fall into and find themselves forced to leave Norway, despite having built a life here. I'm joined today by Kyle Havlicek McClanahan to talk about his situation and why Norway should look at the idea of a work permit for founders and entrepreneurs. You can find out more information on today's show on the show notes page at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Just look for episode 64. Happy listening. I'd like to welcome Kyle Havlicek McClanahan to the latest episode of the Life in Norway show. He is the co-founder and CEO of enterprise software company Scales and has a very interesting story to tell that will be of interest to anyone hoping to start a business in Norway. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, David, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Not a problem. The topic of today's show is why Norway needs a visa for founders or entrepreneurs, basically someone looking to come here and start a business. But we're going to examine that question through the lens of your story, which came to my attention in the Norwegian media a few months ago. But before we get to the details of that, let's hear a bit about your story. What brought you to Norway in the first place?
Yeah, so I moved to Norway first in the fall of 2013, but my relationship with Norway actually began a couple of years before. I had moved to Alaska with my girlfriend at the time, and she had done an exchange year in Norway. And as I was looking for places that I wanted to go and study, Norway was always a bit of a curiosity to me. I'd learned a little bit about it through her, but I'd never been. And it's one of those places that can oftentimes be spoken of in platitudes and as a legend more than a reality. So sure. I wasn't sure what to expect. But as I did my research and actually got to visit over one summer, I found that it was a place and the people that I really identified with. And so I ended up moving to Trondheim at the end of 2013 to take a bachelor's degree.
Excellent. And you ended up staying?
I did. That wasn't something that could have been predicted from the outset. I think one of the things that was most striking about my time as a student was the city itself. You probably know this well yourself, living in Trondheim. It is known as a student city. I think it's something like 1 in 7 are a student.
I would think it's something like that. Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. So the whole life of the town revolves around activities and organizations and just really this wonderful engagement. And I made such good friends and had such wonderful experiences that by the time it came to take my master's, there was no real question. I wanted to continue living there. And then once I graduated, it just felt natural to stay. And now it's been, I think I'm at 9 years this fall, if my math doesn't fail me. So it's been quite a ride. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, you were involved in the entrepreneurship and startup scene in one way or another for quite some time. And so perhaps it's no surprise that you're now involved in a startup. So can you tell us a bit about that story, what you do now and how you got here?
Yeah. So again, something that couldn't have been predicted. My bachelor's is in biology. But like many poor students out there, looking for free food, I found this wonderful community hub. It was a co-working space called Digs, and they would put on events of all kinds, not just for startups or programmers, but about arts and culture and the technology ecosystem. And, I started showing up for the pizza, and I ended up staying for the community. And so by the time I was a master's student, I actually decided to change the direction I was going in. And ended up with a master's in technology management. And that kind of, that gave me the foundation to change my course and go into entrepreneurship more formally. And so in the years after graduating, I ended up working as a consultant. That's a stupid generic term for basically a plus one to startups. So I worked with a lot of founding teams and small companies, basically wearing as many hats as I could. It was a really, really fantastic learning experience, exposed me to different technologies, different industries, different problem sets. And at a certain point, actually very early in the pandemic, I decided to, with a friend of mine from school, go out and start a company on our own. And so that's been about the past 2 years then since we began that journey. Yeah.
So when you are studying as a non-Norwegian in Norway, there is a study permit that people can apply for in order to give them the right to be here in Norway. It's a fairly straightforward process, I understand. I've never had one myself. But when it comes to living here, and especially living here with your own business, it's a much more complicated process. So could you tell us a bit about the permit you have to apply for in order to start a business in Norway?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is there is none, but I'll explain what that means. So
Sure.
As you pointed out, the study permit is straightforward, but it doesn't count towards permanent residency. So by the time you graduate, even if you've been here 2 years, 10 years, if you've only been a student, you don't really have the protections that you would otherwise have if you've been here as a professional working in a company or for yourself. When I graduated, I ended up applying for a sole proprietorship visa, which effectively allowed me to run my own company. And at that time, it was as a consultant. But that is not the same as a visa to start a limited liability company. And in fact, there really is no such thing. So I had the opportunity to start an LLC type organization on this sole proprietorship visa. It's kind of a murky gray area, and I had to do a lot of explaining as to what I was actually doing, for income and for my clients, because the government doesn't really understand the nuances at a certain point. When we started the company, when we started Scales, I was still on this sole proprietorship visa. And in a perfect world, from day one, we would have had all of this money and we could have hired ourselves full time. And then I would have been re-registered as a skilled worker under the skilled worker visa. But as many young companies, we had the first 6 to 9 months where we didn't really have any income. We were living off of savings and we were trying to get first investors. And, what ended up happening to me is that when I went to reapply the following year, at that point, we had Norwegian investors, we had paying customers within our segment in Norway and abroad, but the government was actually looking in the past at that period of time where we didn't have income, and they said, you didn't pay any taxes, you don't get to stay. And that was the beginning of a protracted 23-month process, believe it or not, of back and forth where I kept contesting their decisions, and they kept saying, yes, well, we don't really care how you're doing now. We're looking at this, this one period of time, a year in the past.
Yeah, I certainly do believe it, because I've heard a similar story from many people in the past. Some have left Norway permanently. Others have found ways to stay. So to sum up, if you want to, I should also add, we're talking here for non-European citizens. It does work differently if you are an EU passport holder, but we can mention that later. But for anyone outside the EU, you can apply for a self-employment work permit, essentially. And that's, speaking sort of fairly stereotypically here, that's the kind of business form that an individual would have. So a plumber or an electrician will obviously normally be a sole trader, a single consultant, and maybe someone who is a graphic designer in their spare time. But if you want to start an actual company, a limited liability company with shareholders, with investors and so on, there isn't a visa for that. There is a visa for a skilled worker, which means that company that you start could employ you and you could get a visa via that method. But Correct. The obvious problem there is a new business probably doesn't have the revenue to pay you the required amount straight away. So that's broadly what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. So if you're, let's say you're a graphic designer and you want to come to Norway on a sole proprietor visa, if you're able to get, contracts that bring you, most of the way towards the minimum annual requirement before applying, and the requirement's not that high, right? It's something like 30,000 euros for the year. Mm-hmm. So if you're a graphic designer who's working on your own, generally speaking, you can find work for that amount and then apply. There is a bit of a breakdown, right? If you want to start a business upon arrival that is more than the sole proprietorship. I was in the fortunate position of already having the visa and already having the sole proprietorship from before. So starting the LLC happened sort of on the side. But hypothetically, if you wanted to go to Norway and start an LLC on a new visa, you would have to get the contracts, get the sole proprietorship, and then start the company in parallel as you're working on those contracts or after the contracts expire. But then you run the risk, of course, of not having the sufficient income to demonstrate you've paid enough taxes and are able to care for yourself upon renewal at the end of the first year, because they do run on pretty tight cycles. And that 1 year long cycle is often enough time to build your network and build a basis for your business, whether it's a startup or a sole proprietorship. But it's not enough for much more. So your feet are really to the fire to do things quickly, and the framework itself doesn't lend to making it any easier as of now.
Right. And so essentially what happens to you is you were putting your time and efforts into building this new company. You still had your sole proprietorship on the side. The pandemic hit, the demand for consulting dipped, and your income dipped below the level that was required. So the authorities basically withdrew that permit or didn't renew that permit, and you were forced to leave the country. I know there's a lot more to it than that, but is that essentially what happened?
Yeah, it's essentially what happened. And I think what was most frustrating for me was not the dip in income, but how marginal of a case it was. In the period of time they were looking at, I had stopped consulting and I had started working on the startup, but I was not that far from the minimum requirement. I was something like 500 euros away from actually satisfying it, despite the pandemic and despite the startup. And this is also taken in the context of, at that time, having gotten customers and investors and being on the path that, any government should be really thrilled to see for an immigrant to the country, right? So it ended up being quite marginal, and within the scheme of things, it affected me very little compared to many of the stories I've heard and that you surely have as well. I am incredibly fortunate, but I did get a letter from the police. I was supposed to get it from the immigration authority, but it came from the police more quickly. And they basically said that I had to leave the country by the day before Christmas Eve, 2021. Oh. And if I did not, then, they would pursue legal action, not only in Norway, which would have barred me from ever re-entering the country again, but the letter stated in no uncertain terms that they would pursue the case internationally. So if I did not leave Norway, they would submit something to authorities of the Schengen zone and prevent my freedom of movement in the future, either as a resident or a tourist across all of Europe. So it was not fun, to put it mildly.
And the strange thing is really that this government, or it was actually the previous government now, it was still the Solberg government, when the pandemic hit, the support packages that were available to business were substantial. All kinds of businesses in Norway, there was substantial economic stimulus packages. So they were supporting business in so many ways. And yet your case in particular shows that a lot of people suffered, and perhaps the government didn't have as wide eye on things as they possibly could have.
Yeah, I can't blame them for that in this instance, because this is how the world works, right? You get wind of government stimulus and suddenly all of the lobbyists are at the door. And of course, this is going to mean that individuals working for themselves are kind of last in the pecking order. And they did have many good ordinances for sole proprietors, but that landscape is so much more fractured and diverse than the corporate landscape. So I ended up falling outside of the ordinances and was unable to collect on any of the securities that it would have afforded, unfortunately. So, given the difficult hand, it certainly encouraged me to do my best to make the startup work. And for all intents and purposes, it was until this, this ultimatum to leave the country. It was a choice between residency and startup at a certain point.
Well, on a positive note, Kyle, we're talking today online. I'm in Trondheim, and you're not in the US, but you are in actual fact back in Oslo. So things are looking up for you.
Like I said, David, I'm absolutely blessed and fortunate to be here. Some of it is, of course, the validation of all of the years of hard work and engagement in the communities that I'm a part of. But I can't help but also just feel fortunate knowing how others have been faced with much harder situations at the end of the day. I'm really happy to share that, despite the ultimatum given me and my company, Scales has just been acquired by the largest startup ecosystem actor, Mesh Community. So they run international co-working spaces currently in Norway and Denmark, and they have a community of over 4,000. And they're actually the same co-working space that got me into the startup scene in the first place when I was a student in Trondheim. So it really feels full circle. I started a job this week working with people that I know and really care about. And I'm incredibly excited at what I'm going to be working on over the coming months and years. So happy ending in my case. I will say, though, that there is the unhappy aspect to this with respect to the political process that was kicked off. I know that is one of the reasons that we reconnected not so long ago. But as a result of the media attention around my case and the absurdity of it all, one of the political parties, Venstre, the Norwegian Liberal Party, put a proposal out to Parliament and invited me to speak at the Economics Committee on implementation of a founder visa and updates to the current worker framework so that we could fill this gap between knowledge workers and sole proprietors that we talked about earlier. And after about a month and a half working with leaders in the startup ecosystem and different non-governmental and governmental organizations like Oslo Business Region, Abelia, Mesh Community was a big part of it too. the initiative was voted down. And on one hand, this was expected. Changing the law is not an overnight thing, but we were collectively surprised at how much pushback there was, because there is a shortage of talent. There are draconian immigration laws compared to other parts of Europe, but also to other Nordic countries. So I think this is going to be one of those projects that follows me for the next few years. How can we improve immigration in Norway so that people with ambition, with dreams, want to come here and build something? And as an immigrant to the country whose whole life here has been defined by my own participation in that world, I feel very strongly that it is of huge benefit to Norway and to the region as a whole. And I'm really hopeful that we can make something happen over the next couple of years to this point.
Excellent. Now, this is why really I wanted to dig into your story a little bit, because this isn't a case of someone being denied a work permit. They've been here a year or two. Their business just hasn't worked. They haven't made an effort to integrate, and then they're asked to leave Norway. That happens quite a lot. In your case, you've been here 8 or 9 years now. You studied here, you did a full-time degree. You've learned Norwegian to fluency. You have worked as a consultant, and you've now put efforts into building a business that's going to be much bigger than yourself, that's going to provide value well in excess of what a single person business can do. And yet you've fallen between those administrative cracks. And I don't think anything in what you've said has, I mean, you did miss the income requirement. They weren't being difficult about it. You were technically under the income requirement, so they were just applying the law. What we're trying to talk about here is what's missing in Norway. And there is this enormous gap in terms of people who work for themselves and the certainty that they have in having a position here, and knowing that the next couple of years, they don't have to worry about earning a arbitrary amount, which is, that amount, it feels like it's plucked out of the air. I'm not sure exactly what it's based on. What would a founder's visa that you could well have applied for, what would it look like practically?
Yeah, this is a question that has many answers, David. I think before going into what a visa would look like, it's really important to differentiate between law and process. So my case is not so much a matter of the law breaking down, so much as a process breakdown that made my experience of the law much harder than it had to be. So my case dragged on for nearly 2 years. And this is not a matter of the law being wrong in one way or another. As you mentioned, they're just applying the law. But if I had had the opportunity for this to come to resolution much sooner than it did, I would have actually had the ability to reapply anew within my startup as an employee. But I was stuck in this protracted process that could not run in parallel. So that's a little bizarre. With respect to the law and to founder visas, the main difficulty is really assessment criteria, right? If you have a dollar amount, arbitrary or otherwise, that you need to satisfy, then it's very cut and dry. You're going to earn this much money, you're going to pay this much in taxes, and based on, whatever the cost of living and inflation and whatever else is taken into account, you can care for yourself, right? That's black and white, and so they follow it to the letter. Once you start looking at founder visas, you're presented with a Pandora's box of subjectivity. What is it that's actually the guarantor of your stay? How far have you come in the entrepreneurial journey? Do you have investors? Who are those investors? How much have they invested? Who are your customers? How much do they pay? What is the subscription term of their payment, right? These all contribute to defining the quality, let's say, of an applicant. One thing that has been discussed a lot is not so much having a new founder visa within the framework of pre-existing law, but a new ordinance that exists beside it that can give a middle ground to a more permanent visa. So one of the things that the skilled worker visa provides is a 3-year window of certainty once you start with an employer in Norway. Mm-hmm. In the case of founders, there really is, a 12 to 18 month period where you are proving product market fit. So you have a solution, you have an app or a web service or whatever it might be, and you need to show that there is a demand in the market for it. And there generally is a limited window of time in which this can occur. And that's the middle ground where you need that additional stability that currently doesn't exist in the legal framework. And that is where the greatest impact, I believe, could be made for founders, to say, okay, we're not going to give you the whole visa, we're not going to give you all of the benefits, but we are going to give you a foot in the door so you don't have to worry about yourself over the next 18 months. And then we can judge how you've done, and you can ideally apply for the visa that already exists. Because putting process aside, the law for skilled workers more or less works. And if you're a successful startup founder and you are able to demonstrate product market fit, you're going to be able to hire yourself. You're going to want to hire yourself, because then you have the securities of healthcare and pension and holiday pay and all of the wonderful things that the social safety net here provides. So it is that middle ground where I think the law is lacking outside of process. And just to be really quick to process, to make a comment on that, it's not unique to Norway. A lot of countries are struggling to transition government services to digital, and streamlining that with respect to immigration is quite difficult, right? It has security concerns that your average smartphone app doesn't have, and you're working with a lot of legacy systems that were built sometimes in the 90s or in the early aughts, and it's not a matter of just building it and they will come. There's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of different stakeholders who have to be involved in transitioning process to the modern age. In some respects, countries that were further behind have it much better than countries that were digital first. So Norway was early out with a lot of digital services in the 90s and the aughts. What that means is that they now have to struggle with translating and updating old systems. But if you look at a country that digitized later on, they get to leapfrog that early technology, and they can just go straight to what is best out there for them here and now. So it's actually a weird challenge to be presented with, because you would think that a country as advanced as Norway would have an easier job digitizing, but the problem actually stems in part from their digitalization of process before many other places did it.
That's very interesting. And in many ways, Norway's digital offer is ahead of many countries. I mean, the tax return this year, for example, was the first year in a new system, and it worked many months faster than in previous years. So things are improving, but I absolutely see what you mean there. Are there any other countries we can look at here for some inspiration? I know, for example, the Netherlands has been testing out a startup visa. Are there any other countries you think Norway can look to and say, here's a template for how this could work?
From the process and technological perspective, Estonia is brought up a lot. They have a digital e-residency, and you can register a business on the blockchain in minutes. Finland and Sweden both have their own iterations. The Netherlands is a good example. And then, of course, the US and the UK are more or less destinations for founders, and they have well-established frameworks that require a greater degree of maturity to be accepted, but nonetheless are able to manage hundreds of thousands or even millions of cases a year. With respect to what inspiration we can take that I think is most applicable, it is to do with the law and the culture surrounding the spirit of law and the spirit of immigration, because immigration is not an easy topic for government, because there are a lot of differing opinions on the topic of immigration. And it's not fair to say, yes, well, we are founders or we are technologists that are doing something that is more valuable than someone who wants to come here for other reasons. I think you're walking a really fine line, and looking at it from a monetary perspective and differentiating between groups of people really goes against the ethos of the Norwegian culture, right? You have this idea of equitable treatment. And what I think can be learned is that exceptions are not necessarily always negative, but in the same hand, or at the same time, Norwegian immigration policy has really been focused on refugees for a very long time. The majority of immigrants to Norway come as refugees, and that's fascinating, but it's also colored the politics and the dialogue around the topic. And I do feel like there is a degree of xenophobia here when it comes to immigration in general. Maybe not something people will openly discuss, but that you experience through other, softer forms, the way you're included or excluded, the degree to which your journey as an immigrant is communicated and facilitated by the authorities and by the communities and society at large. So I'm hoping more than anything that there can be the mental frame shift towards immigration for skilled workers and for founders as a new class. And I hate hearing myself say it as that out loud. But an exception is not always a negative. But then more broadly, it's very hard to address the topic of immigration without some really loud voices coming into the room and saying opinions that I personally don't believe belong in a modern society in the 21st century. But that's a topic for another day, perhaps.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think you say the word immigration to typical Norwegian, and it is refugees in the asylum process that they think about straight away. And in many respects, it was the same in the UK with the Brexit debate. Certainly don't want to get into that. But, the difference between people coming for protection into a country and people coming as economic migrants, it's an entirely different thing. And the processes and the discourse need to reflect that. But I also think there's a wider discussion to be had. We don't have time today, just about the government's approach to entrepreneurship. And in general, I mean, Norway is seen as a nation of employees, and there's no doubt about it. To be an employee in Norway, you have some of the best conditions anywhere in the world. And it's not always easy to be an entrepreneur here. You don't get a lot of the same protections. So yeah, we shall see. You can see that once a company gets to a certain size, the number of startups that have moved their base of operations to London or to the US is quite quite noticeable, I think. So yeah, there's a huge opportunity and challenge here for the government in the years to come with entrepreneurship. That's for sure. Kyle, thank you very much for joining us today. Just before we move on to the final questions, wondering if you have any comments on the differences between the lifestyle in the US and the lifestyle in Norway. It is something we've talked about with many guests on the show before, but you seem to be extremely happy here in Norway. So what is it that makes you so keen to be back here and call this country your home?
It's the best question. I am, despite everything, despite being kicked out, I am an outspoken fanboy of Norway. And it's really just a matter of the life one can create for themselves here. You don't need to be a startup founder to be comfortable and to really love the balance you can find here. And I think that's the word that I keep coming back to when I talk to others about Norway. It's balance. It's balance between city and nature. It's balance between work and personal life. It's just so comfortable and so easy, but it also, I'm someone who likes to challenge themselves, both in my professional life and outside in nature with, skiing and climbing. And I think the security and the way of life really affords you to go outside of your comfort zone in ways that are harder if you're overworked and underpaid and concerned about healthcare. The baseline quality of living gives you the freedom to explore throughout life in ways that are, I think, all too rare. And I, for that reason, and dozens of others, cannot see myself calling any other country my home. Period. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Okay, I'll ask you now the same three questions I ask every guest on the Life in Norway show. You've pretty much already answered the first one just now, but I'll ask it anyway. What's the best thing about living in Norway?
Being alone in the woods in the fall.
Okay. And the most challenging thing about living in Norway?
The food. I miss a lot of food.
Well, is it the variety and choice you're talking about, or the quality?
So you have an increasing variety and an increasing choice, and the quality is improving too. But I'm from the Bay Area in California, and it's one of the most abundant food producing regions in the world. And the food culture is so deeply ingrained in the culture at large. I think seeing the food culture develop in Norway in my time here has given me a lot of hope. And it is night and day from when I first arrived. But You know what? I still can't go get a good burrito to save my life, right? So there are limitations, and I definitely plan my travels abroad around my stomach.
Yeah, you're not the only one who does that. We've just returned from 3 or 4 days in London, and food was definitely top of the list when we were planning the itinerary. And a final question, Carl: where is your favorite place in Norway, whether that's a whole town or a tiny spot somewhere secluded?
Yeah, I've spent almost every summer up in the north in an island chain called the Lofoten Islands, and there's one hike there to a small cabin called Munkebu that is overlooking the mountains and the lakes and the fjords, and it's just my definition of heaven on earth. But anyone visiting Norway certainly has to go to Lofoten. It's not easy to get there compared to the major cities, and you're going to be surprised at how much more expensive it is once you get north of Trondheim. But it is a place and a trip that you will never forget.
Well, there's a +1 from me on that recommendation. I'm actually taking my parents there this summer. This will be their 5th visit, I think, to Norway. It's the first time we've had the opportunity to get up there. Even from Trondheim, it's a bit of a journey. So, yeah, looking forward to that. Carl, thanks for joining us today. I'll include links to some of the press coverage that you've had over the last year, and some of some of the stories about you working with Venstre and what the politicians have been saying, and so on, in the show notes page. I think it's almost all in Norwegian, but I'll include those links in there anyway for our listeners who can read Norwegian. And yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, David. It's been a lot of fun. And I'll let you know next time I'm in Trondheim, now that I'm back.
Excellent.